Lobotomy scheduled at dawn in the asylum. A Lakota chief broke her out and gave her her mind back. The chain on the gate was my father's. I recognized it by the bent link near the clasp, the one my grandfather had fixed with a piece of wagon iron 40 years before I was born. That chain had been on this land longer than the state of Wyoming, and the man who'd looped it through the iron post and padlocked it shut was a federal marshal named Corbett who didn't know that, and wouldn't have cared if he did. I stood there in the cold, 4 in the morning, and I looked at that chain. That was October of 1887. I had ridden 9 hours. My horse was standing 15 yards behind me with her head down, too tired to graze. The sky was just starting to go that particular dark gray that isn't black anymore, and there were no stars visible because a front was moving in from the northwest. I could smell snow coming. Not that night, maybe 2 days out, but coming. I looked at the chain for a long time. Then I went back to my horse, pulled the short-handled axe from my saddle roll, walked back to the gate and cut through the post instead. That is not how my grandfather would have handled it. He would have waited. He was patient in a way I have never been. He used to say that the land itself is waiting, and we are only expressions of it, and impatience is a man declaring himself separate from the land. I thought of that while I swung. I thought about it and kept swinging anyway. The post was pine and dry, and it went in 4 blows. I am telling you this because that is how everything in this story started. Not with a wise decision, not with a plan, but with me taking an axe to something because I had run out of any other idea. Her name was Clara Marsh. I had not known her more than 6 weeks when this happened. The agency had been trying to fence off the eastern grazing section since spring. Corbett was their man. He came twice, both times with papers, both times with the same flat expression men wear when they've been paid enough to stop having opinions. The second time, he brought 2 other men with him. They stood by his horse and watched in the way men watch something they intend to finish later. My name is Lakota. My grandfather was chief before my father before me. I am not going to explain what that means or what it costs, because it is not the part of this story that matters, and I am tired of explaining it to people who use the word chief, the way they use the word horse, as a category, not a person. What matters is the eastern section, 40 square miles of mixed grass and creek bottom that we had grazed since before any American institution existed to give or take permission. The agency wanted it fenced and transferred to a cattle operation out of Cheyenne. They had papers. We had been there first. These 2 things in 1887 had a known resolution, and it wasn't us. I had ridden to Larkspur to file a counter-complaint with the land office there. It was a half-day's ride, a useless errand. I knew it was useless before I went, but there is a kind of stubbornness that keeps going through motions because the alternative is to stop moving entirely. The land office was staffed by a man named Gruber who was decent enough, personally, and powerless enough that decency cost him nothing. I was tying my horse outside the land office when I heard her through the open window of the building next door. Not screaming. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't the kind of sound that announces itself. It was a voice, a woman's voice, speaking with total even-keeled clarity. The calm of someone who has been told they are hysterical so many times that they have learned to subtract all emotion from their speech and still not be believed. She was saying, "I am not ill. I have told you this. I understand that you disagree, and I am asking you again to tell me the legal basis on which you are holding me." A man's voice said something I couldn't catch. Low and practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to not being questioned. She said, "That is not a legal basis. That is a description of my behavior. The 2 are not the same thing." I stopped with my hand on my horse's neck. There was a pause, and then the man's voice again, louder. "Miss Marsh, the commitment papers were signed by your brother and countersigned by 2 physicians. You will be transported to the state institution on Friday." She said, "My brother wants the farm. You know that. The physicians have been in his parlor twice for supper." Silence. "Then Friday, Miss Marsh." I stood there a moment longer. Then I went into the land office and talked to Gruber, who told me there was nothing he could do. I filed the papers anyway. I walked back to my horse. I thought about the woman's voice, that peculiar controlled calm of someone fighting with their hands tied. I thought about it the whole ride home. I told myself it was not my business. I believed that for about 3 days. I found out the facts the way you find out most things on the frontier. Someone talks to someone who talks to someone else, and by the time it reaches you it's part true and part story. What was true? Clara Marsh had inherited a farm east of Larkspur from her father, who had died the previous spring. She had a brother, Edmund, 7 years older. The farm was modest, but the land under it sat on a good aquifer, and Edmund wanted to sell to the same Cheyenne cattle operation that was after my grazing section. Clara had refused to sign. Edmund had called in favors. What was story? Some people said she had fits. Some said she spoke to her dead father. Some said she was one of those women who reads too many books and gets strange ideas. These things were not said as concerns. They were said as explanations, by people who found it easier to believe a woman was broken than to believe she was being broken by someone. I knew the difference. I had watched the United States government apply that same logic to everything I was. I rode back to Larkspur on Thursday. I tied my horse at the livery and I walked to the address someone had given me, a boarding house at the end of the main street, where Clara Marsh was being held. Not in a cell exactly, but in a room she was not permitted to leave, with a woman from the county office sitting in the hallway outside. I stood across the street and looked at the window on the upper floor, and I thought about what I was doing and whether it was wise and what the consequences were, and I concluded that none of that mattered very much. Consequences were already coming regardless. I had filed papers that would irritate Corbett. My people were already in the government's eye. One more thing I could do or not do, and if I didn't do it I would know exactly what I had been when it counted. I went to the front door and knocked. The woman who opened it was stout and not unkind, just doing what she'd been told. She looked at me and her face went through the particular sequence white faces went through in 1887 when a Lakota man showed up at a door. Surprise, then concern, then the careful calculation of whether to be rude or careful. I said I was there to see Miss Marsh on a legal matter. I said it in the measured way I had learned to speak to white institutions, not deferential, that never worked but precise and quiet and giving nothing away. I had learned that from my grandfather, who understood that the only armor that didn't weigh anything was composure. She said Miss Marsh wasn't receiving visitors. I said I understood, and that I was going to file a legal complaint on behalf of Miss Marsh with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne regarding a fraud that connected her brother's actions to a fraudulent land transfer that was also being perpetrated against my people. And that if Miss Marsh was transported to the institution before I spoke with her, that complaint would proceed without her knowledge or input, which might result in an outcome that didn't serve her interests as well as it could. Most of that was true, about half of it. The woman looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Wait here," and she went upstairs. Clara Marsh came down those stairs like someone who had been sitting very still for a very long time and had finally been given a reason to move. She was 31 or 32. I found out later she was 32, with light brown hair that had come partly loose from whatever she'd done with it that morning, and her eyes were the particular dark gray of clouds that are moving fast. She was not beautiful the way stories mean when they say that word. She was something better. She was sharp. There was a quality to her face like she was solving something, always, like the world was a problem she hadn't finished reading yet. She looked at me, and she didn't do the thing people do. She didn't hesitate or recalibrate. She looked at me the way someone looks at a door they've been waiting to open. She said, "You're not from the land office." I said no. She said, "But you know about Edmund and the aquifer." I said yes. She said, "Then why are you here?" I thought about the honest answer for a moment. I said, "Because I heard you talking through a wall and you made more sense than anyone else I had listened to in 6 months." She was quiet for a moment. The woman from the county office was at the top of the stairs, watching. Clara looked at me and she didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in her face, some small tension leaving it that I don't think she'd been aware was there. She said, "You have about 4 minutes before Mrs. Hollis comes back down and tells you to leave. What do you actually want to tell me?" I told her what I knew about the Cheyenne cattle operation. I told her what Edmund was doing wasn't just about the farm. I told her about the land grab that was happening across the whole territory and her brother's connection to Corbett, and how a complaint filed correctly in Cheyenne could create enough legal noise to stall the transfer, possibly long enough to get her a real hearing. I told her that the complaint would be stronger with her signature on it. She listened with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted. She asked 3 questions. Each one was exactly the right question, the one that identified the weakest point in what I'd said. She was not testing me. She was just built that way. Then she said, "They're transporting me Friday morning, at first light." I said, "I know." She said, "Edmund has already been to the institution and arranged it. There's a procedure scheduled. They call it a treatment." She said that word the way you'd say the name of something you weren't going to dignify by being afraid of it. I knew what she was talking about. I had heard about it, the procedure they were doing in Eastern institutions, what they called science. I stood in the hallway of that boarding house and I felt something settle in me, down through my boots and into the floor. Not anger exactly, something colder and more useful than anger. I said, "I'll be outside before dawn." She looked at me again with that quality she had, like she was reading something carefully before deciding whether to believe it. She said, "You don't know me." I said, "I know what I heard through a wall." Mrs. Hollis was coming back down the stairs. I nodded once to Clara Marsh and walked to the front door and out into the last warm afternoon of October. I did not sleep that night. I rode back toward my land to make arrangements. I told 2 horses what I was doing and why, and 2 horses, who had been my father's most trusted man and was now mine, listened without expression until I was finished, and then said that I should not go alone. I said I was going alone. He said that this was the wrong choice. I said probably. He handed me a rifle. I left before midnight. The boarding house was on the eastern edge of Larkspur and had a side door that opened onto an alley. I had noted it on my way out. I brought 2 horses, mine and a bay mare I trusted to be quiet. I came around to the alley at 4 in the morning, and I stood in the dark and I waited. This is what waiting feels like when you don't know how it ends. Your mouth gets very dry. The sounds of a sleeping town, a dog, somewhere, the creak of a sign, these become enormous. You develop opinions about the wind direction that you didn't have before. Your hands are fine. Your hands are always fine. Hands know what to do. It's the space behind your eyes that fills up with everything that could go wrong. At 4:10, the side door opened. She had a bag, small, 1 change of clothes and whatever documents she'd been able to keep. She had put her hair up and put on her heaviest coat, and she came out that door like she'd been waiting for this her whole life, and was mildly irritated it had taken so long. She looked at the 2 horses, she looked at me. She said, "North." I said, "North." She said, "Good." She got on the bay mare without asking for help. I don't know why that mattered to me, but it did. The first hour of that ride I was listening for pursuit. You learn this early, how to track sound behind you while your eyes are forward. The sound of hooves on hardpan carries a different distance than on soft earth, and the shape of the silence between sounds tells you something if you know how to read it. That morning, nothing. Just the cold, the horses, the dark dissolving ahead of us in increments. She rode close on my right, which was either trust or practicality. I decided it was both. She had a light hand on the reins, not nervous, not forcing. The bay mare settled into a rhythm next to my horse, the way horses do when they've made up their minds about each other. We crossed the creek at the shallow place I knew, and headed north along the ridgeline where the track was firm, and the sky was visible above us. We rode for 2 hours before I said anything. The cold was real, not dangerous yet, but the kind that goes through a coat and sits next to your skin and reminds you it's there. She rode without complaint. I had half expected she would need to stop to adjust, to process what she had just done. She didn't. She rode at the same pace I set, and she watched the horizon the way travelers watch it, looking for information, not scenery. When I judged we were far enough north that Larkspur was behind us in a useful way, I pulled up near a creek bend where we could water the horses. She pulled up beside me. We dismounted in silence. The horses drank. The creek made its noise. The sky was beginning to show the first gray-white of early morning at the horizon's edge. She said, "I want to know what you get out of this." I said, "A witness to what Edmund and Corbett are doing together. Your testimony, in writing, connects the two land grabs. It makes the complaint credible in a way it isn't without you." She said, "That's true, but you could have just got me the message, left a note. You didn't have to come yourself." I looked at the creek. I said no. She didn't push it. She crouched down and dipped her hand in the water and held it there for a moment despite the cold, and then she stood and dried her hand on her coat. She said, "How far to your land?" I said 4 hours. She said, "Will your people accept me there?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Some will, some won't. You'll be a complication either way. The ones who matter will accept you because I asked." She nodded. She didn't thank me for the honesty. She just nodded and got back on the mare. I found, riding alongside her, that I was watching her more than I watched the country. That is not something I do. I watch the country always. It is habit and practice and survival. But I kept finding my eyes going to her profile, the set of her jaw, the way her hands were easy on the reins. I caught myself at it and stopped. Then I caught myself again. Eventually, I let it go and just watched her and accepted that this was what was happening. My grandmother was the one who made the decision about Clara Marsh. I want to be careful about how I say this, because my grandmother's authority in these matters was total, and if I make it sound like a kindness or a softness, I will have gotten it wrong. It was not softness. My grandmother, Winona, was 81 years old, and she had watched the world she knew disintegrate piece by piece for 60 years, and she was still standing in it with the same directness she had applied to everything since before I was born. She did not give her approval easily, or take it back once given. She looked at Clara Marsh in the doorway of our winter lodge, Clara standing straight, tired from the ride, coat dusty, eyes clear, and my grandmother looked at her for a long time the way she looked at things she was deciding about. Then she said something in Lakota that translated, roughly, as, "This one has been carrying water in a broken pot for a long time and doesn't know her arms aren't tired from weakness." I told Clara later what she'd said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in 3 years. My grandmother put her in the lodge nearest the central fire and told 2 of the younger women to feed her. That was the decision. After that it was fact. The following days were not simple. Corbett came looking on the 3rd day. He didn't come to my land, he was smarter than that, but he sent word through the agency that a woman had escaped lawful custody and that anyone harboring her was in violation of federal statute. I received this message, and I read it, and I set it on the fire. That was a choice with consequences, and I knew it, and I did it anyway. Edmund Marsh rode out himself on the 5th day. He came with a hired man, and they stopped at the edge of my land where the fencing used to be before Corbett's people had cut it, and Edmund called out for his sister. He was a big man with a soft face. the kind of face that has learned to look reasonable on top of everything else it is. I rode out to meet him. He looked at me with the expression men like him use on men like me, the one that is meant to communicate that the conversation is already over and he is merely informing me of the result. He said Clara was unwell and required care, and he had made arrangements. I said Clara was not on my land. That was not true, but it was the right thing to say, and I said it without inflection. He said he had papers. I said papers didn't cross my boundary. I said it quietly. I was aware of the rifle across my saddle, not pointed at anything, just there. He was aware of it too. There was a stretch of silence between us. The hired man behind him shifted in his saddle. A crow went over. Edmund looked at my land the way men look at things they intend to take. Not with want, exactly, but with that particular blankness that has already decided and is only waiting on the logistics. I had known men like Edmund my whole life. Different names, different faces, but the same fundamental quality. An absolute inability to imagine that anyone might hold something he had decided to want. Not cruelty, exactly. Something worse, a complete absence of the imagination that would let you understand what you were doing. He said he would go to the federal marshal. I said, Corbett already knows where you are and what you're doing. If Corbett solves this problem for you, you now owe Corbett more than you did this morning. Is that what you want? Something shifted in his face. Just briefly, men like Edmund understand accounting above everything else. He said he'd be back. I said I'd be here. He rode off with his hired man, and I watched them go. And when they were small enough in the distance, I let out a breath I had been holding since he'd started talking. I should tell you about the evenings. After the first few days, Clara was given work. She asked for it, which was the right instinct, and my grandmother gave it to her, which was the only thing that would have been accepted. She helped with the preparation of hides, which she was not good at and didn't pretend otherwise. She helped with water. She sat with my grandmother in the evenings, and my grandmother spoke to her in Lakota, and Clara listened with the same quality I'd noticed in the boarding house, that complete, unself-conscious attention, like she was reading carefully. She asked me to translate sometimes. Other times she seemed to understand without translation, which I thought was impossible, and then stopped thinking was impossible after a while. We talked most nights. Not long conversations. I am not a man given to long conversations. But she would sit near the fire after the others had gone, and I would sit across from her, and we would talk about the land, about the complaint, about what we knew of the legal situation and what we could prove. She thought in straight lines. She didn't go around things. I had known some educated people who used their education like a wall between themselves and anything hard, and she was not that at all. One evening she asked me about my father. I told her what I could tell without telling things that weren't hers to have. She listened. Then she told me about her father, how he had taught her to read a surveyor's map, how he had taken her to the land office 3 times in her childhood and shown her every document relating to their property, because he had told her, "This land will be yours, and a woman who doesn't know what she owns is a woman who can be made to give it away." She stopped. I waited. She said he knew Edmund would try it. I said yes. She sat with that for a while. The fire made its sounds. Somewhere outside a horse shifted and stamped. She said, "I have been so angry at my father for dying and leaving me in this. For the last 6 months I have been angry at him every day." I said nothing. She said, "And he did everything he could before he went. He gave me everything I needed, and I still wasn't strong enough to use it." I said, "You're here." She looked at me. The fire between us had burned low. I said, "Whatever it cost you to get here, you're here and your mind is whole, and that procedure they scheduled is something that didn't happen. That's not nothing. That's not small." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You risked a great deal to come for me." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I had thought about how to answer this if she asked. I had thought about it for several days. I had good, practical answers prepared: the legal complaint, the testimony, the strategic value. I had them ready. What came out instead was, "Because you were the first person I had heard in a long time who was simply right. In the middle of a situation designed to make her wrong, you were just right. And that mattered to me." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked back at the fire. She said, "No one has told me that before." I said, "I know." The complaint took 3 weeks to prepare properly. This is the part that history, when it decides to record any of it, always leaves out: the paperwork, the sitting, the writing and rewriting. The arguments about precise language, because vague language is a door that gets used against you. Clara knew her father's documents by heart. I had 2 years of agency correspondence and survey records. Between the two of us, spread across a low table in the council lodge with the smell of pine smoke and ink, we built a case. Some days we worked from before sunrise until the oil in the lamp went low and the cold came in under the door. My eyes got tired before hers did. She would still be reading and cross-referencing when I needed to get up and walk outside into the night air and look at the stars and let my head go quiet. I would come back in and she'd have found something, a date that connected, a surveyor's name that appeared in 2 documents, a discrepancy that meant something. I started bringing her coffee without being asked. Just set it beside her. She started saving the last biscuit from supper in a cloth and setting it on my side of the table without comment. That was the shape of it, a series of small, unannounced things that accumulated into something I didn't have a name for yet and wasn't looking for one. 2 horses helped. He didn't say much, but he came every morning and sat and read what we had written the day before, and when something was wrong he pointed to it. He had a mind for structure, for the way one piece depended on another. Clara noticed this about him before I told her who he was, which tells you something about her. My grandmother sat with us on the 5th day of document work, which she had never done before in any legal matter. She sat to the side and watched, and after 2 hours she said something in Lakota that 2 horses translated for Clara. She said the woman writes like someone who has been answering questions she was never asked. Clara stopped writing and looked up. 2 horses said, "It means your mind was ready for this before you were. She thinks that's rare." Clara looked across the table at me. I kept my face neutral, but I felt something, a warmth in the chest, the kind you try not to show because you don't know yet if it's returned. Edmund moved faster than I'd calculated. On the 22nd day he got a federal warrant, not through Corbett, but through a judge in Cheyenne who had connections to the cattle operation. The warrant was for Clara's return to county custody, and it was served not to me but to the agency, which relayed it with the note that failure to comply would result in, and then a list of consequences for my land and my people that was thorough and specific. This is the part I'm least proud of. I spent a night alone with that document, and I went to a place I have been before and hope not to go to again, the place where you add up what you have against what they have, and the math comes out the same no matter how many times you do it. I'm not a man who despairs easily or often, but in the dark, with that warrant in my hand, I could feel the weight of everything the United States government had taken from people like me, and understood with full clarity that it was not done taking. I sat outside on a flat rock my grandfather used to sit on. He used to say that stone remembers, and if you are still enough it will tell you what it knows. I had never been sure I believed him. I sat on that rock for 4 hours and it told me nothing I didn't already know, which maybe was its version of an answer. 130 people, their children, the winter coming, the eastern section that we had fought for and were still fighting for, a legal complaint filed but not answered, a warrant in my hand with my name on it attached to a clause that would give the agency justification to revisit every boundary we had. I could send her away. That was the alternative. I could send Clara Marsh away with the documents we'd prepared, and whatever contacts she needed and remove myself from the situation, and maybe protect my land and my people from at least this particular consequence. It would not be cowardice. It would be strategy. It was the kind of sacrifice that could be argued for. A man who had 130 people depending on him could argue it easily, could make it sound like wisdom rather than what it was. I sat on that rock until the stars moved enough that I knew it was well past midnight, and then I went inside and lay down and did not sleep. In the morning, Clara came to find me. She found me outside, standing at the edge of the grazing section with the warrant in my hand, and I suppose something in my face that told her what the night had been. She stopped a few feet from me. She didn't ask what I was holding. She already knew. She said, "I'll go." I said nothing. She said, "I can get to my aunt in Kansas. She has a house and she's been trying to get me out of Wyoming for 2 months. I can file the complaint from there. It won't be as strong without you, but it'll be something. Edmund won't stop, but he'll slow down." I said, "Going alone puts you at risk between here and Kansas." She said, "I've been at risk for 6 months." I said, "That's not an answer." She looked at me with that gray sky quality in her eyes. She said, "Lakota, you have 130 people on this land. You have your grandfather's chain on a gate you cut down to come for me. You have," she stopped, "you have more here than I have anywhere. I won't let you lose it on my account." Something happened to me then. I'm not going to describe it in the way stories describe such moments, with all the interior poetry of a man discovering a feeling. That is not how it happened. What happened was, she said that, and I understood that she meant it, and the understanding went through me like a sound goes through a room, filling all the space and then still being there after. I said, "Finish the complaint." She said, "Lakota." I said, "Finish it, file it, and then we'll decide what happens next. But I am not sending you out there alone into whatever Edmund has arranged." She stood looking at me. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of day where the sky is so blue it looks hard, and her hair was moving in the wind, and she was completely still in the middle of that movement. She said, "Why?" That word again, the same word. I said, "You know why." She looked at me for a long time. Then she closed the distance between us and she put her hand on my arm, not reaching for my hand, just her hand on my forearm through my coat, a plain and direct thing, and she said quietly, "I know why. I just needed to hear you say it out loud." I put my hand over hers. That was all. That was the whole of it. Standing on the edge of the grazing land my grandfather had grazed, in the morning cold, with a federal warrant in my other hand, and a woman who was the most clear-eyed person I had ever stood next to. We filed the complaint from Larkspur itself, which was either bold or stupid, and at the time felt like both. Clara walked into the land office with a folder 3 inches thick and Gruber, to his credit, went pale in a way that suggested he knew what he was looking at. The complaint named Edmund Marsh, named Corbett, named the Cheyenne cattle operation, named the judge who had issued the warrant, and drew the explicit connection between Clara's fraudulent commitment and the illegal fencing of federal grazing land that had been in continuous use by my people. It had 19 exhibits. 2 horses had numbered every page. Gruber said he would have to send it to Cheyenne. Clara said, "You'll send it today." She didn't say it hard. She said it the way you say a fact. Gruber sent it that day. What happened after that was slow and ugly in the way legal things are slow and ugly. I'm not going to dress it up. The complaint sat in Cheyenne for 3 months. Corbett made 2 more attempts to fence the eastern section. The warrant for Clara was technically still active and she could not go back to her farm. Edmund made a private offer through an intermediary, money, a resolution, a clean ending, and I sent the intermediary back with nothing. But things were also happening that I couldn't see. The complaint had been picked up by a newspaper in Denver. I still don't know who sent it to them. And there was a story, not a long one, that named the cattle operation and the judge, and used the word conspiracy. in a sentence that also used the word federal. The judge developed a sudden interest in recusing himself. Corbett requested a reassignment and was transferred to New Mexico in February, which I understood was not a reward. In March, the warrant for Clara was vacated. I don't know all the reasons. There were enough reasons by then. In April, a federal arbitration hearing on the grazing land was scheduled for June. Clara was at the table for that hearing. She was not a party to it. Legally, it was a matter between my people and the federal government. But she sat in the gallery with her folder and her gray eyes, and when the government surveyor made an error in his reading of the boundary markers, she stood up, and the arbitrator, after a pause, allowed her to speak. She corrected the survey with citations, 3 citations from memory. The arbitrator looked at the government surveyor. The government surveyor looked at his papers. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. The June hearing was held in the federal building in Larkspur, which was a single stone room with 4 windows that let in the morning light at a low angle, so it hit the floor and not the people at the table. There were 9 of us on one side, me, 2 horses, 2 other men from our land, Clara, and the lawyer she had located in Denver, who had taken the case for reasons that mixed principle and the kind of publicity that can build a reputation. On the other side, there were 4 government men, and the surveyor, and an attorney from Cheyenne who had the smooth face of someone whose job was to be believed regardless of what he was saying. The arbitrator was a man named Dillard. I had no information on him beforehand, which meant either he was clean or he was so thoroughly bought that his name never surfaced. I spent the first 30 minutes watching his hands, which is the part of a person that tells you the most, whether they're still or restless, how they move when something lands wrong, whether the pen moves when expected or just sits. His hands were still. He wrote when he wrote. I decided he was probably clean. The government's case took the morning. Their surveyor, a young man, competent, doing what he'd been paid to do, presented boundary data that placed the eastern section inside the transfer land by a margin of about 40 yards on the critical measurement. 40 yards. 37 years of use, 4 generations of my family's grazing history, 2 years of my own legal effort, and their number was 40 yards off the number my grandfather had recorded. Clara sat beside me through the morning and she did not write anything down. Her hands were folded on the table and she was simply listening. With that quality she had, the complete attention, the reading carefully quality. I watched her instead of the surveyor and I saw the moment she found it. A slight stillness, then an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, a fraction, the way a person moves when something snaps into place. She wrote a single number in the margin of her paper. I looked at it. It was the date from one of her father's surveys, the one that predated the government's baseline by 11 years. After the lunch break, when the arbitrator asked if our side had anything to present, our Denver lawyer began with the land use records. The government's attorney objected twice. Dillard overruled him twice, both times without looking up from his notes. Then Clara stood up. I had not known she was going to do it. Our lawyer had not known either. I saw his expression in my peripheral vision, the brief surprise, then the calculation, and then he sat back and let her go. She corrected the survey with citations, 3 citations from memory. The arbitrator looked at the government surveyor. The government surveyor looked at his papers. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. Dillard made a note and called a recess. During the recess, I stood in the hallway with 2 horses, and he said nothing and I said nothing, and we both knew something had shifted that might or might not stay shifted. These things go sideways. You win the room and lose the decision. You know this and you've known it since before you were old enough to understand what knowing it costs. But Clara came out of the room with color in her face, and she stood next to me in the hallway and she said, quietly, not to me but not to me. He wrote it down. Dillard wrote down the date I cited. 2 horses looked at me. I looked at the wall. I said yes. In the end, we got 60% of the eastern section back. Not all of it, but 60%, with a formal record of our prior use and a boundary marker that was legally established and would cost anyone substantial effort to contest. 2 horses called it a beginning. He is not a man who uses optimistic language carelessly. Edmund's sale of the farm fell through when the cattle operations principals were named in a separate federal investigation later that year. The farm remained Clara's. She went back to it in September. I rode with her. 2 horses and 3 other men came along, which was more escort than she needed and less than I wanted, and we didn't discuss the number. It was a small farm. The house needed work. Edmund had let it slide in the months he'd been trying to sell it. The barn was sound. There was a kitchen garden that had gone to seed but showed the bones of something her father had built with care. She stood in the doorway of the house and looked at it. I stood behind her in the yard. She said without turning, "It's a mess." I said, "It's yours." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Will you come back?" I said, "Yes." She turned around then and looked at me. She had dust on her coat from the ride and 1 strand of hair across her face, and she looked at me the way she had looked at everything from the beginning, reading it fully, without flinching, deciding what she believed. She said, "I need you to know something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "What you did coming to that boarding house, the warrant, the hearing, all of it, I know what it cost. I know what you put at risk. And I want you to know that I see it, not just what you did, what it meant that you did it." She paused. "What you are." No one had said that to me before, not in those words with that plainness. My whole life, my whole adult life, I had been seen as a category, a problem, an obstacle, a symbol of something, and I had learned to exist inside that the way you learn to exist in bad weather. You keep your head down and you keep moving, and you do not expect the weather to notice you back. She noticed. I crossed the yard. I stood in front of her and I put my hand against the side of her face, the kind of touch that is asking a question. And she turned her face slightly into my palm, a small and deliberate thing, and I understood that was the answer. The men behind me found something urgent to do with the horses. I am 68 years old now, telling this. The farm is 20 miles from my land. That is the right distance, close enough, far enough. We have managed it for 30 years. Clara keeps her books, I keep mine. The farm is part of something larger now, and my land is part of something larger, and the eastern section grazes my grandson's horses. She is 62. She reads at the table by the window every morning before the house is fully awake. I come down and I pour coffee and I set hers next to her without interrupting whatever she's in the middle of, and she puts her hand briefly on the back of mine without looking up, and that is how every day starts. People ask me sometimes, younger men mostly, men who have heard some version of the story, what it was like to ride into Larkspur that night with an axe. I tell them, I was scared and I did it anyway, and that's the whole of it. Fear is not the thing that decides. The thing that decides is what you do with your hands while you're afraid. They ask about Clara. I tell them she is the most honest person I have ever known, and that honesty is not the soft virtue people imagine it to be. It is the hardest one. It takes more out of you than courage does. One of my grandsons, he is 12, asked me once why I went back for a woman I barely knew. I said, because she made sense, and I was tired of things that didn't. He thought about that. He is a serious child, that one. He said, "Is that why you married her?" I said, "Partly." He said, "What's the other part?" I looked out the window at the morning light on the grass, at the eastern section where the horses were out, at the sky that was that particular clean October blue my grandfather had once described as the land breathing in. I said she put her hand on my arm and told me she wouldn't let me lose what I had on her account. No one had ever done that. Thought of what things cost me, just her. I paused. That's the other part. He was quiet for a while. Then he nodded, like he had filed it somewhere useful. The light moved across the room. Outside somewhere, a horse was running, just running, not going anywhere, the way horses do when the morning is cold and good. Clara's coffee was going cold next to her book. I reached over and moved it closer to her hand. She put her finger on the page to hold her place and picked it up, without looking at me, and took a slow drink. That is the whole of it. That is all of it.